How does China's social credit system actually work that are supporting me? But still, thank you. I really appreciate you all. So, okay, China's social credit score. Honestly, when we were talking about this, my friends, it's easier to talk about what China's social credit system is not rather than what it is. Ever since the year 2014, when China first announced a 6-year plan to build a system which would reward actions that build trust in society and penalize the opposite, this has easily been one of the most misunderstood things about China in the West, though I will say this right now, I definitely love the jokes. And I also know for a fact that every time I've talked about anything with China, their history, and the complex geopolitical issues that come from it, instantly the comments in the comment section below are always going to be diluted with people that say, hey, social credit score minus 1,000 points. Because I talked about something that I probably shouldn't have, or at least what the CCP does not want me to actually talk about. Either way, for most of the people who are outside of China, the words social credit system, this is something that brings up a very clear instant image, something that is like this Twilight Zone web of technologies that automatically take every single Chinese citizen and score them according to what they did right in the eyes of the government and what they did wrong. This Black Mirror-esque idea is something that is terrifying to us, but the reality is that this terrifying system doesn't really exist. Nor does the central government really have any ability right now to build it, or perhaps even the desire to do so, at least not to the level that we have imagined it. Instead, what we're talking about here with the social credit system is that this is something that the central government has slowly been working on and is a vast mix of different kinds of attempts to regulate the financial credit industry, to enable government agencies to share data with each other and promote state-sanctioned moral values, which, yes, okay, that last part is very vague, and it sounds more similar there to what people imagine the social credit system to be, but we're going to explain that. Really, when we look at this, there is no evidence yet that the system has been widely abused or is widespread enough in the first place to enable grand social control. Though, of course, I say that, it is indeed possible that this could be wielded to restrict individual rights. That is true, and in some cases, in certain cities, this is something that appears to have happened. The interesting detail to note about all this is that local governments are the ones who seemingly have been much more ambitious with their more innovative regulations, we will say, to say the least, I guess. These on the local level have caused significantly more controversy and public pushback, and so a countrywide social credit system is something that is going to take a long time to fully materialize if it ever actually does. But okay, we are using all of this terminology. First of all, what exactly is social credit? Hey everyone, Sakuya here, and before we get back to the episode, I just want to thank each and every person that went on my trip to Italy here with me and my wife, because I had a ton of fun with you all. Whether it was going to the Roman Colosseum, whether it was exploring the forums, whether it was going to all these different things, it was an absolute blast, and I cannot wait to see more of you in future trips. One of the things that I love, perhaps more than anything else about this job, is specifically that I get to go to places and meet with people all over the world. That's something that I've always enjoyed. And for anyone who's watching this right now, it would make my world if you would join me at the German Christmas markets that I will be leading a trip to here come this November. We are going to see the Christmas markets in Munich, in Salzburg, and Vienna. We are also going to see castles. We're going to see all kinds of different sites. And even beyond that, just the base trip, we're also going to be going and doing a little bit of exploring around and seeing other things with some people while we're there. Honestly, when you go on one of these trips, it's really nice because you don't typically have to worry about planning anything. From having a guide who speaks the local language to be able to take you around, from your hotel accommodations being taken care of while you're there, and in general, the fun of going to places in a group, it's not something that I can really describe. It's just something that you have to experience for yourself. There's only a limited amount of spots, so if you want to join me on this trip to Germany, you only have to put 25% down if you book it now. And beyond that, there are payment plans moving forward in order to make things easier for people. Obviously, at different points, I'm going to do more random meetups with people, but if you want to go on a dedicated trip with me, this is your chance. Thank you, everyone. Now back to the show. To explain it, when the Chinese government goes and talks about social credit, the term covers two different kinds of things. On one hand, you have the traditional financial creditworthiness, and on the other hand, you have social creditworthiness, something which draws data from a larger variety of sectors that all kind of interact with each other, or at least that is what the Chinese government has been planning. The first thing that we mentioned here is something that for those of us in the West is a very familiar concept. It is something that documents individuals or businesses' ability to pay things back, their financial history. It predicts their ability to be able to pay back future loans. Even though China is run by the CCP, the Communist Party, their economic system is more of a mixed market. And what's interesting about that is that it is very young. The modern market economy in China is less than 50 years old. And so because of that age issue, it means that the country lacks a kind of a reliable system that is able to look up people's and companies' financial records in order to be able to, well, judge them. Building that kind of system, something that is aimed to help banks and other market players make business decisions, this is something that for any kind of modern developed nation is an essential and most certainly not very controversial idea. Most Chinese policy documents refer to this type of credit with a specific word, zhenjin, something to which many scholars have translated to as credit reporting. Considering how rapidly China has grown over the years, it makes sense that when you are dealing with million, then billion, then trillion-dollar companies, that you're going to need to verify exactly how creditworthy they are in order to do their specific business actions. The problem, or the confusing part when we get into this though, is the latter one, the social creditworthiness. This is something that creates significantly more concern. Basically, the Chinese government is saying that there needs to be a higher level of trust in society, and that they need to nurture that trust amongst the population. The government needs to fight corruption. It needs to fight telecom scams. It needs to fight tax evasion, plagiarism, literally anything that you can think of that would be bad or dishonest or anything like that. That is what the government wants removed, or at least what it wants removed on paper. That is nothing to be said about individuals who profit off of corruption, which is true in just about every system. Under this idea of social creditworthiness, not only will individuals and companies be held accountable, but legal institutions and government agencies will be as well, which, considering everything that we've talked about with China on any of my videos, that is a pretty big deal. There is a lot of corruption in China. And so that, my friends, is where things start to get a little bit confusing. The government seems to believe that all of these problems are loosely tied to a lack of trust, and that building trust requires this kind of solution that is effectively a one-size-fits-all. So, just as financial credit scoring helps to assess a person's creditworthiness in the case of trying to get a loan, some form of social credit can help people assess others' trustworthiness in other respects. As a result, the social credit scoring is oftentimes lumped together with financial credit scoring in policy discussion, even though it is a significantly younger and untested thing with almost no precedent in any kind of society. The closest thing that we could probably make a comparison to is that although we have the modern credit system, like when you are trying to get a loan and they check out your credit score, what used to have to be done is that you pretty much needed to know someone at the bank. You would have to have people who would vouch for your character and ability to be able to pay something back. This same kind of thing is what applies here, but on a significantly more broad scale, and something that uses modern technology as well as different rating systems depending upon the city and where you are. And that's just the thing, my friends. What makes this so extra confusing is that in practice, local governments have sometimes mixed up these two things, where your social credit is something that factors into more of your financial creditworthiness, and that in turn creates significantly more issues. As an example, you may see a regulation that talks about how non-financial activities will hurt your financial credit score, or vice versa. For a specific example of what I'm talking about, and I know that I'm going to butcher the name of this, but the province of Liaoning had said in August of 2022 that it was exploring how to reward blood donation in the financial credit system. As in, like, you went and donated blood to a blood bank, and this is something that would increase your credit score, which I will say that is wild. But you start to get the idea then. Which brings us to the question, I guess, of has the government of China actually built a system that is actively regulating these two types of credit? Well, the short answer with this is no. Sort of. But no, not. It's complicated. Initially, back in the year 2014, the plan was to have a national system in place that would track all social credit ready by the year 2020, which now at the time that I'm making this, it's 2024. And this long-anticipated legal framework didn't really come into existence. The first draft of anything was seen back in November of 2022. So then, what has actually happened? Well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here when I talk about all this, so we're going to need to go back into the beginning and explain some context. While the introduction of a unified Chinese social credit system was formally announced in the year 2014, precursors to the proposed social credit system have operated within China for quite a while. Like, we could honestly go back hundreds or even thousands of years, but that seems a little bit too far-fetched and too loose of a connection. Essentially, when getting into more modern demographic data, in the 20th century, public record systems were developed for record keeping and also to monitor the behavior and actions of ordinary individuals. As an example, there was something called the hukou system in place since 1958, which would register households, control internal movement within China, and assign benefits to households depending upon whether or not they were rural or urban or their specific locations in those types of areas. This was very important for the new communist regime to better manage its people within their new utopia. Of course, you'll know when I've talked about anything in here in history that the Maoist utopia was anything but that. And things honestly would not begin to improve for China until after they would eventually open up. So in 1978 to 1979, the reforms then of Deng Xiaoping would open up the Chinese economy in varying different ways, including the open door policy that for the first time in a while would permit foreign investment in communist China. And so it's at this point on that things get significantly more complex, because the lack of a traditional credit rating system, as well as significant amounts of corruption within society, all meant that business was going to be much more complicated and troublesome in China, something that could easily be seen as a limitation on economic prosperity. Other countries, of course, have also had similar issues, but by contrast, many developed Western nations at this point, like the United States, already had computerized credit analysis by the 1960s. That is not FICO for anyone who is wondering. The FICO system didn't really become big until going into the late 1980s, which is a whole other story right there, and that is something that is still a little bit of a complex and touchy issue for some today. But either way, not only did the West have longer credit systems, simultaneously they had technology to help them with these efforts significantly earlier. This brings us then to the mid-1990s, when the first credit database was being constructed within China. The People's Bank of China would develop an early database providing financial credit information to commercial banks. This was formalized in the Banking Credit Registration and Reference System, which is sometimes translated as the Bank Credit Registry and Consulting System, that would be established in 1997. This is all well and good then, but more needs to be done. And by 1999, the idea arises for a real and more national credit system, not just something for local cities and banks. So it is then that the premier at the time, Zhu Rongji, would assign a research team at the Institute of World Economics and Politics of the Chinese Academy of Sciences to investigate solutions to corrupt market behavior. Which again, if you have seen literally any of the videos that I have talked about when it comes to China, you would know that the corruption at this time was really bad, and there is a reason as to why they would want to do this. To dive into that for a second, the early market reforms of Deng Xiaoping gave a lot of discretion and authority over the sale of land to local governments. Revenue that was generated by land sales and the sale of mines could very suddenly be stolen by local officials and their business cronies just with complete impunity. There was really nothing that anyone could do about this, which would have insane profit margins. What I mean by that is that local governments would essentially be able to acquire land for very cheap. Sometimes this was done through coercion and literally forcing peasants off of their land. And these officials, typically the upper ones in that location, could then make significant profit by selling land use rights to real estate developers, even if those land rights were still state-owned property, technically speaking. Because they could get this land so incredibly cheap, literally anything that they did to sell it was more than likely going to make them a profit. Bribing local officials essentially became normal business practice in order to get these land assets and make huge profits. The approach would, weirdly enough, benefit entrepreneurs who wanted to start business, as well as officials. But when we talk about this, it's mostly the top level officials in local administrations. These would be the people who actually had the authority to allocate land resources and directly determine its price. The control over the regulatory approvals that were needed to obtain projects in order to get these things actually done, this was in the hand of the local communist cadre officials. They could seize land from its current users, which again was mostly the peasants, but also from anyone who was in a kind of urban environment. It didn't really matter. And they could then use their control of the police and their local institutions to force this to happen. The police during this time would then naturally become part of the local corruption. where these local officials were able to take what they wanted for very cheap, sell them off for a cheap price, pocket the difference, and yet at the same time in doing this, their friends, allies, and other people who were their supporters were able to get this land cheaply and then build a business upon it. Needless to say, there was a lot of corruption, and that is still a problem even to this day within China. You've already seen how we've talked about state-owned enterprises and their own issues, but we're going to be getting back into that in a second because that's going to need an update video all on its own. So it was then that in response to this and many more issues that the National Credit Management System was released, advocating a centralized system which would bring together data from across China. The focus of the system at the time, though, was purely economic. We're talking about debt defaulting, contractual breaches, non-compliance with regulations. All of these things were the key points that needed to be addressed within this new system. And so it is then that from this point on, localized city testing of this new system would begin, with variants occurring in different cities in order to be able to test how effective they were. Remember, at the time that all this is taking place, China does not have an actual credit system. There's nothing that really scores people. It's not standardized at all, and so different cities are having to figure out exactly how is it that we score someone. As an example of what I'm talking about, in the year 2000, Shanghai would introduce a credit system which would assess people's eligibility for loans by just looking at whether or not they paid their utility bills. Yeah, see, that's the thing. They really didn't have that much to go off of besides, hey, did you pay the water bill? Yeah? Okay, here's the money to go and start a ping pong ball factory. They didn't really have anything else. So these systems then persist for a while, and by 2004, you would start to see official endorsement from leadership that really gets things moving. Then President Jiang Zemin would endorse the social credit system in his report called Build a Well-Off Society in an All-Round Way and Create a New Situation in Building Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. Holy crap, that is a long name for a report. Anyway, the stated goal of this was to establish a social credit system that was compatible with a modern market system. To further this, trials on a consumer credit reporting database would begin with 23 state-owned and commercial banks across 7 different municipalities. That would then bring us to 2006 with the Credit Reference Center being established. The Credit Reference Center was created to be a nationwide independent credit reporting agency. Banks were required to start reporting on customer creditworthiness at this time, and through collaboration with government departments and the Supreme People's Court, additional information relevant for creditworthiness began to be reported. Of course, depending upon where exactly you're getting this information from, this could vary, but hey, it is still a start. As 2007 rolled around, the Joint Interministerial Conference on Social Credit System Construction, aka the Joint Conference, this was something that was set up to coordinate the development of this system. Participants in this conference included key government departments and agencies such as the Minister of Finance, the State Administration for Industry and Commerce, the Ministry of Public Security, and many more. Members were also included from the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, which is the chief anti-corruption body in China, the Central Guidance Commission on Building Spiritual Civilization, oh my god, these names. That was the chief force in China that was responsible for the ideological purity, essentially something that was aimed at a socialist harmonious society, whatever that would actually mean. And of course, also the Supreme People's Court was involved. As the government is trying to coordinate this more and more, moving into 2009, regional pilots of the social credit system commence, with one of the most well-cited cases about this being the system that was introduced in Suining County, Jiangsu Province. The way that this system would work is that individuals were given 1,000 points, with the ability to either gain or lose points based on their behavior. What I mean by behavior is that convictions or debt non-repayment, as an example, would mean that points would be deducted from your total score. And after all of these were calculated, the points were used to create a letter grade ranging from A to D. The result of those letter grades in turn would affect employment opportunities, your access to get business licenses, eligibility for government support, among other things. As another example, in 2013, the Chinese city of Rongchen would make headlines when it would experiment with a social credit system that would rank citizens' social behavior with a number. This is something that we're going to mention here later on this line in this video, but essentially, certain behaviors would add to the score, while others would subtract from it. A AAA rating would bring with it an array of benefits, while a D rating would result in a loss of privileges, and even in some cases, basic rights. Of course, saying the word basic rights when talking about anything with China is, well, it's up to interpretation, to say the least. And of course, it was the local government that would then define the behaviors that would be encouraged and those that would be frowned upon. One of the more worrying parts of this outline, though, was that it would urge citizens to report people who, quote, participated in futile superstition or cult organizations. When I say the word cult, we're pretty much talking about any kind of religion, organized or otherwise. Of course, when I mention that, clamping down on religious freedoms is really nothing new in China. Even to this day, harsh prison sentences and violence against religious activists, this is something that is still reported. Also, before I move on, there's something that I absolutely have to mention here. It is very ironic that the government's idea of trying to build trustworthiness within society involves encouraging citizens to snitch upon their neighbors in order to try and win favor from the state. But again, hey, it's China. Either way, one may wonder what exactly would happen if you got snitched upon and your score would fall below an acceptable level. Well, in Rongzhen, there were a variety of different punishments. You had reputation punishments like public naming and shaming. You could have reduced access to government benefits and support. In the event of security checkpoints, you could have higher routine scrutiny and being checked more often. Considering how many things are done in China through the government, one of the other issues that would be faced is restrictions on participation in government projects, restrictions on attending regular business functions, restrictions on market entry or professional qualifications. Like you literally could not get qualified something because they would not allow you. Of course, that's not to say that there weren't any kind of benefits that one could get. If you had a higher score than if you were in a place like Nanjing, in 2016, they introduced something that was a social credit card. Basically, your higher score would allow you to get discounts on products from things that are like owned by the government. You could get preferential treatment by financial institutions. Literally, there were cases of people who would get loans, and with these loans, you would have a lower interest rate, so you didn't have to pay back as much. Like that is huge when talking about million-dollar deals. As for how you could be assessed for something like this, yes, it would look at your actual financial history, but this is a system that would also look at your individual willingness to donate blood and whether or not you were recognized as a hard worker, whatever that actually means. Okay, I skipped ahead to like 2016 and had to bring up all those individual examples. We are skipping ahead by a good amount of time, but it's important to point out how most of these initiatives were being done on a very local level. This is not something that was being done by the national government, no matter how much it is that people try to tell you this online. In fact, some things were so incredibly localized in small towns that the local councils of these small towns would straight up hire investigators to walk around and catch people misbehaving in order to judge and lower their scores, because they simply just didn't have the technology to actually do anything at that time. Moving on from this, in the year 2013, the Supreme People's Court debtor blacklist would be established. This list would publish the names and ID numbers of defaulters, people who refused to pay back their debts. As well as the shame that was associated with being on this list, defaulters were simultaneously prevented from a range of different expensive high-end expenditures, including traveling and staying in certain hotels. Like, as an example of this, what it's saying is that you could not have a person who took out a $300,000 loan who then refused to pay back that loan and then go and spend money on like an $8,000 or $10,000 flight to somewhere, like in first class. They would not be allowed to do this. Which, to be fair, makes sense because in the eyes of the government, you can't just take out loans, not pay these things back, and then continuously spend ludicrous amounts of money on luxury things rather than the basics that would need to be done in order to pay stuff back. Notably, when talking about this would apply not only to individuals that did this, but also the legal representatives and officers of the companies that were in default. So if you were even just a basic worker that was being like, okay, hey, the company is going to send you from Beijing down to like Shandong or something like that. If you are going there and you have to fly there or whatever it is that you're going to do, we would normally put you in business class. But because the company is in default and is now blacklisted, you, as that person that is being sent down as a representative of the company, are legally not allowed to take a higher class seat. You can't. By the year 2017, it was estimated that 8.8 million debtors had been added to this list, which is a lot, but that is the year 2013. So it is then that we move on to the year 2014, and the credit system is announced. The State Council would release their plan, which was, quote, the Planning Outline for the Construction of a Social Credit System, 2014 to 2020, in 2014. The 5 objectives for this system listed in the document would include the establishment of necessary laws and regulations for social credit, the completion of a credit investigation and sharing system for all of China, developing credit supervision systems, a market for credit services, and establishing mechanisms for keeping trust and punishing those who fail to do so. That last part is where the previous thing that we mentioned really comes in handy, the development of blacklist and redlist. That is going to be a key part of the Chinese system. In 2016, the State Council would emphasize the standardization of blacklist and redlist from this point on. Blacklist and redlist became so incredibly commonplace across government departments, with more than 50 being in operation at this time. These lists would in turn work hand in hand with the model city trials of 2017 through 2018. Widespread adoption of regional trials of social credit systems would begin, with 12 such cities in 2017 being classified as model cities. Perhaps the most prominent example of all of these that I've talked about is Rongchen, which, again, we just mentioned that here previously in this video, but there are more. That in turn then brings us into 2019, when the government of China starts to move towards AI. The State Council would release the, quote, guiding opinions on accelerating the construction of a social credit system and building a new credit-based supervisory mechanism. Holy crap, these names! Essentially, this would emphasize the need for big data and artificial intelligence to provide early warning of possible risky actors that were in need of extra regulatory attention. It wasn't enough that an individual could be tracked through paperwork. You had to have a system that could catch someone before they potentially defaulted on all these loans. Essentially, the government realized that with as many people that were in China, in trying to wrap up as many people as they could within the system, they were not going to meet the goal of 2020 for this new system. It wasn't going to be able to be launched, and they would need to use more AI and preemptively catch things. But, of course, this is 2019 going into 2020, and COVID happens, and that kind of throws everything for a loop. Because now, of course, social credit has to be factored in to the pandemic. But okay, that is the story of how we got here. That's where we kind of are now in this immediate post-pandemic world. But what does it all mean? What is happening right now? And how does the social credit system work as it stands? As I have previously said, the Chinese social credit system is something that rates individuals based on a variety of different data. In some trials that we have seen, this has involved a single numerical score, usually between 1 and 1,000, like a FICO score, or a letter grade, which is usually from A to D. As an example of just some of the factors that could be considered in giving a corporate social credit rating, these things would include whether or not the business has paid taxes on time, whether or not they have the proper licenses to do their specific business, which they would think that that's an important factor in the first place, whether or not the business fulfills environmental protection requirements and other regulations, whether or not the business meets product quality standards. All of these things are factored into that particular business's score. But what is extremely important to note here is that one business's score may also decrease or increase based on the behavior of their partners. Yes, you heard me right. What this means is that enterprises need to actually think about who they do business with in China. As an example of what I'm talking about here, let's say that you have a Chinese company that makes something very simple. They make a type of clothing, a t-shirt. But that t-shirt is perhaps dyed with a chemical that ends up creating severe skin irritation. I don't know, we're just creating a hypothetical at this point to talk about this. A chemical is perhaps banned for use in China, but then anyone who goes, like any kind of brand who buys that shirt and uses it as a template base in order to be able to create another product out of and then sell, because they are doing business with someone who is doing an illegal action that hurts their credit score, the person, or rather the entity that bought that t-shirt to use it for another thing, they in turn also get their score affected. And that could be pretty severe for an individual or company, because the thing is, there are a number of punishments in this credit system. Of course, I say that, but as the Chinese social credit system is still in a state of evolution, it's pretty much impossible to say with absolute certainty what in the future the negative consequences are going to exactly be on the national level once this is fully implemented. The only thing that we can go off of is based on the local local government tests, because this is pretty much what has happened. But if some of these consequences come to pass, just as they did on the local level, then the potential negative effects of a bad score, once fully implemented, would include things like being banned from traveling. If you're wondering what I'm talking about, reports would come out in 2019 that would indicate that 23 million people would be blacklisted from traveling by plane or train due to having a low social credit rating that was maintained through the Chinese National Public Credit Information Center. Though many of these issues went away, it is understandable to assume that this is something that, if fully implemented in a national credit system, this would apply as well. You could actually be banned from traveling, and this is a joke that many people would make online. Another consequence in the system is that you could be banned from going to school. The social credit score could actually prevent students from attending certain universities or schools if their parents had some kind of poor social credit rating. And we have an actual example of this. In 2018, there was a student who was denied entry to university due to the fact that his father was present on a list of debtors. He was blacklisted. This was one of the blacklists that was designed to punish debtors by preventing them from flying, using high-speed trains, booking fancy hotels, or enrolling their children in expensive schools. Things that were basically able to be done because they refused to pay back their debts. This would appear to be the kind of blacklist that the student's father, identified by his surname of Rao, would end up being on after he failed to pay back almost $30,000 to a bank after 2 years. This kind of thing is pretty scary for the average person, and the move was somewhat controversial in China, with What's on Weibo, a news site that reports on Chinese internet trends, finding 30,000 comments on just one news thread that was about the story. There have apparently also been a handful of other schools that would reportedly reject applicants because of their parents' social credit scores. But despite the fact that there was a large public outcry, the suspension of Rao's son ended up actually being effective, apparently. Just as a little side story, Rao reportedly went and paid back the money and actually moved to have his name cleared off the blacklist. So it worked. The system in China actually worked. So yes, education is affected. And then another example is, after you even graduate from university, reduced employment potential. Employers in this system, if fully implemented, would potentially be able to consult blacklists when making employment decisions. In addition, it's possible that some of these positions, as in like government jobs or things affiliated with the government, which are important for the CCP to maintain a high level of security and stability, these would be restricted to individuals who meet certain social credit ratings. Even in the event that one is not part of the government, if you go into a business, businesses with poor scores may be subjected to more audits or government inspections, because if they are found to be regularly violating regulations, this in turn means that the government is going to need to investigate them more. Besides these very real consequences that we are talking about, one could even just simply be shamed. In many cases, regulators have encouraged the naming and shaming of individuals who are present on blacklists. It becomes increasingly difficult over time for businesses with low scores to build relationships with local partners who can in turn be negatively impacted by their partnership. Because think about this, if your score can decrease just by interacting or doing business with someone who has a low score, that in turn means that you're not going to want to really do business or interact with them very much. You shame them into doing better. Of course, if the individual or business then fails entirely because they literally cannot improve their score because no one wants to do business with them, that's a whole other issue entirely, but you know, they're working out the kinks, I guess. Yes, it is really crazy that engaging with a company that has a low social credit score could reduce one's own social credit score. In addition, if an individual with a poor social credit rating opens up a business, that business may automatically start with a lower social credit score. Thus, you can't have someone who has a company, they burn it to the ground basically, and then just start a new company and everything is fine and dandy. You see that actually a lot with many places in the West, with companies that get ruined and people just start up a brand new one. But either way, we've talked a lot about consequences, what all of these things mean, but how exactly does one end up lowering their score? Obviously, businesses can get their score lowered by not paying back their loans or other things, but how does an individual end up affecting their score? Well, there are many ways to lose points and lower one's social credit score, depending upon the city in which the offense that you do takes place. And some of the actions that we're talking about here are downright trivial. And let me give you some examples. One of the things that has been touted is if an individual does not visit their parents on a frequent basis. Family is extremely important in China, and so if you go off on your own and don't go back to your parents regularly, if you just leave them, this would be seen as abandoning your family, and thus that is something that lowers your trustworthiness. Another thing is jaywalking. You have going and walking your dog without putting it on a leash. So if you're just walking through the street and your dog is next to you, doesn't matter if it's trained or not, that's not something you can do. If you're smoking in an area that you are not supposed to be smoking in, like it's a non-smoking zone, or even, and this is one that I truly find hilarious considering that I have a gaming channel, cheating in online video games, which, holy crap, that is super common in China. Yes, enough of these actions could have you placed on a local blacklist, of which there are many. China currently has a number of national and regional blacklists that are based on varying different types of violations. It is expected that over time, this system of blacklists would eventually be fully integrated across the national board with the new social credit score, whenever that actually does fully get implemented, but we don't know yet. But either way, this would definitely have an effect. Businesses can be placed on a blacklist due to a particular violation or because of their, in general, poor social credit score. A government notice that was released back in 2016 even encouraged businesses to consult blacklists before they hire someone or assign them a contract. While the Chinese blacklisting system is still something that is in its early stages, even after all these years, it's already something that is one of the most prominent systems of its kind worldwide. As I've said before, a number of these lists have already blacklisted thousands of Chinese residents' abilities to buy plane tickets and travel domestically or abroad. That is scary, and that is something that a lot of people joke about, but simultaneously, what it is that we are seeing here, and I hope you understand from this video, is that most of the blacklisting that seems to have occurred to this date has been the result of violations or misbehaviors of companies and the individuals working for them, and so the ones who are typically blacklisted are companies rather than individuals. As for how long one could potentially be on a blacklist, it typically takes 2 to 5 years to be successfully removed from a blacklist, which often has a negative impact on the privileges afforded to those individuals and businesses in society during that time, so it can be a pretty severe thing. On the other end of the spectrum, there are positives of this for people and corporations who are determined to be outstanding members of Chinese society. When we talk about this in this kind of context, the opposite of being blacklisted is to be redlisted. And if you are redlisted, well, this is something that allows citizens and companies to access certain privileges that will impact their day-to-day lives, which would include a number of different rewards, such as streamlined administrative procedures. Now, I say that, but as an example of what that precisely means, companies that are classified as a, quote, advanced certificate enterprise may receive faster customs clearance. So if you are a company that does your business, you are in good standing with the government, you have a good social credit score, then that means that when you are either exporting or importing anything, customs is cleared faster because you get priority. Which for a business, that is really good for your turnaround time. Which, on that note, that in turn brings us to a very weird thing that I did not think that I would actually be addressing in this video when I was researching and writing it. The actual benefit of the system. Not just benefits inside the system where you get rewarded for something, I mean in general the benefit of having such a system. While there is most certainly valid concerns that have been expressed about the trials of the social credit system so far and the restrictions on individual liberty, which are severe if that does happen, the potential benefits for foreign companies who are looking to extend or establish their operations in China, that is something that has to be mentioned and it cannot be underestimated. If this system works as intended, which of course that is a big if, the social credit system would mean that there would be a kind of leveled playing field against domestic companies. Because there would be significantly more publicly accessible data, foreign companies would be able to know who it is that they are doing business with and find reliable partners. This is especially important for when enterprises first enter China because oftentimes they would have no idea who they are dealing with. The information in local Chinese regions would be more so known by local Chinese companies who would be able to tell whether or not a particular company is more trustworthy or not. But by having this kind of data, foreign companies that are looking to invest in or find partnership with Chinese companies would actually have a hard system of data that they could utilize to judge someone. But either way, that all being said, that brings us back to China and the Chinese system and where we are now. 2020 was the original target year for the implementation of the social credit system. However, a range of factors, including the impact of COVID-19, would delay the full establishment of the system to the point that it hasn't really happened yet. Throughout the course of 2020, there were 4 significant variations to the social credit system in response to the pandemic. Now, these changes were not necessarily applied nationally, but they were applied regionally and by municipal local governments, and would depend upon how they were impacted by the pandemic. The things that these would change would include exemptions from penalties, like individuals or corporations that could show that breaches of contractual or tax obligations were due to COVID-19 and not their own fault. They were made exempt from penalties, so their scores were not lowered. In addition to this, social credit rewards were given for entities who contributed to containment of COVID-19. On the other hand, for the opposite side of the spectrum, there would be penalties for companies that would exploit the pandemic or break restrictions, such as those who would price gouge and try to steal as much money as they could possible from public funds that were meant to be used for COVID relief. The final part of this was simplified loan granting procedures. In certain cases, individuals or entities in industries that were heavily impacted by COVID had their process of getting loans simplified and expedited in order to make sure that they could stay afloat. That is pretty much how things were for the next several years. Everything was in a kind of state of limbo. And as of 2024, there still seems to be very little progress on actually rolling out a nationwide social credit score. That is not something that is happening now or anytime soon. Reportedly, all of the private social credit ratings that were being done in local municipalities, these have also been shut down, and most of the local government pilots for these have ended. Whether or not that's anything that will actually be applied to a national system, we don't know, but the jokes on the internet are going to continue. The Chinese social credit system so far is more so just a collection of disparate rating systems, something that is largely administered by central and local government agencies. While a comprehensive individual social credit score was originally supposed to happen by 2020, so far that is something that has only been rolled out on a corporate level. But as for what the future is going to bring, who knows? Maybe eventually we all will be living in some kind of Chinese Black Mirror episode. Right now, no. Either way, thank you, my friends. This has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel, or whether or not that you are listening to this on the actual podcast itself. Either way, I appreciate each and every one of you who has been with me throughout all this time. Thank you, my friends, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye, guys.